Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled How a Threat Actor Really Views Your Organization. Before we get started, there's one housekeeping item to keep in mind. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on demand shortly after today's broadcast. Now let's get started. My name is Ryan Powell. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing at CyCognito, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Anne Marie Zettlemoyer, Chief Security Officer at CyCognito, and Marc Rogers, who's the Adjunct Senior Advisor at the Institute of Security and Technology, a member of the Ransomware Taskforce, and Head of Security for DEF CON. Thank you for joining us today, Anne Marie and Marc. We look forward to your discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And thanks, Marc, for joining me today. I always love getting together with you, and our conversations are always hilarious. So thanks, brother. I appreciate you coming on today. We're going to have some fun.
My pleasure.
As Ryan and I were talking about this and brainstorming on some topics, I was reminded of a couple conversations that I've had recently with partners and peers. And I mean, folks that are in our, partner organizations, CIO, engineering, legal, risk, finance, about threat actors and how we are meant to defend against their different motives and techniques. And it surprises me every time how often I hear this notion that they think, it's a very sophisticated actor with very sophisticated methods that are trying to attack or that we have to defend against. In other words, they don't necessarily give credence to easy ways in, right? Or visibility into the attack surface or what you have because, they don't know that there's an ROI and investment in there, right? So now, they get caught up in this, Hollywood stealthy image of the threat actor, which you have a lot of experience in as well. And so I would love to get your perspective on what you've seen, how attackers approach a target, approach their own mission, and their line of work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are sort of the minority of nation-state ninjas out there breaking into places, but the vast majority of threat actors are opportunists. They are criminals who are looking to break into organizations, sometimes because they want to do something with that organization, but often now just so they can get into the organization and sell that access. And they're not looking for complicated ways of doing it. They're looking for, in the equivalent of the physical world, the open bathroom window that they can climb in through and break into a house. They're looking for those opportunities that will give them access. And in particular, they're looking for people who've got highly sensitive access or just interesting technical access because they know they can sell that for more.
What I think is interesting to that point is that, in our discussions, Marc, and we've talked about this before, how, the old way of doing things is you sort of had one person sort of doing it all or one team doing it all. But now we have so many threat actor services that have been commercialized, right? And so some of the times the objections I hear from engineering teams is, oh, so what if they get in? They can't steal anything. Who cares about this data? Whatever. And why would I spend so much time trying to inventory everything when my crown jewels are here? But the reality is that there are businesses, right? Threat actor businesses, and now there's huge commercial opportunity for that just spend their entire time trying to find these unknowns, these unknown windows or these unwatched windows, and sell that service. What have you seen over the years in that type of aspect?
Yeah, so criminal organizations have always been businesses. They've always been there to generate money, and how readily that money can be generated has always driven the evolution of crime. We saw early in internet people starting to monetize things, and we watched that evolve over the last few decades. We've had things like banking Trojans come along and be highly sophisticated engineered pieces of malware that are used to break in, but the operations behind that, as it becomes more about money, have become increasingly like startups. And you look at them and they have the same kind of structures as a company has. And so it never ceases to surprise me that some companies fail to see that while they can monetize data, so can criminals. And sometimes the criminals are almost exactly the same in that they'll try to eat every piece of the cow. They will take any bit of data and look at how they can monetize it. And we should never be surprised about a criminal's ability to monetize something that they can steal from us. And so that means you have to protect everything.
Right. Even in it's funny is because we have these different groups that specialize in certain parts of the kill chain or whatever shop you're thinking of, kill chain, threat actor life cycle, whatever. So there's organizations, criminal organizations, or just even lone wolves, whatever, that are going to continuously enumerate your surface to find what you don't see, what you're not looking. And you can easily buy that, right? There's, folks that will create the exploit kits, and there's a marketplace for that. And then there's, folks that will create the lists of potential targets from whether it's a third party supply chain target or an individual human, if that's what you want. So the threat actor, as you mentioned earlier, really wants to work efficiently, right? And has these tools at the ready at low cost, wouldn't you say? And so, how does that translate into whether or not a defender can really consider if it's a nation state? Does it even matter, right? At this point, have we not equalized the skill set with this marketplace of tools for the attacker?
Yep. They're always going to look for the easiest way to achieve their goals. Why should you spend hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars on a zero-day exploit if you can wait until 2 weeks after Patch Tuesday and weaponize a bunch of the security vulnerabilities that got patched around then? We know organizations are behind the curve when it comes to patching. And so we know there's a window of opportunity for N days to compromise them. The criminals know this too, and they're not going to throw money away. They're going to go after those opportunities. And sometimes they don't even need to get as sophisticated as an exploit. The vast majority of ransomware attacks start because of leaked information, accounts leaked in breaches, exposed infrastructure like RDP. Like, they're not going after highly sophisticated weaknesses there. They're going after the open doors and windows. And even if we just make a start at closing all of our doors and windows, we're going to improve things so much.
Well, I would even take a step back and say, should we even know where they are? Let alone do we attempt to close them? So I see 2 points in there. One is, do the organizations have the visibility that they need in order to know what to defend first, or even make those decisions? Because I don't know about you, but in my life as a practitioner, the visibility stats are dismal, right? We might say we are closing all of the highs and mediums as far as known vulnerabilities go, but when you're only looking at this much of your network and calling that a win, as an attacker, you're sort of counting on that, right? Yeah, look over here because I know all of these other doors exist that you're not even watching, right?
Yeah, show me a security leader who doesn't have a horror story about some kind of piece of shadow IT or some kind of modification that was done outside of normal process, because people need to get their jobs done, and sometimes they see the structure that gets put up by security as a barrier and something for them to overcome and get around. And the next thing you know, you've got unauthorized wireless access points running inside your networks. You've got VPNs going into random locations. You've got employees offshoring their jobs to China because they can get work done and hold down extra side jobs by doing that. All of these risks are real, and you have to be able to have visibility to track them.
I think so. Every time I talk about anything, I'm just a big proponent of hygiene, not just in visibility, but are we cleaning things up? Are we protecting against misconfigs? I love what you said earlier that a lot of times, it's not the sophisticated stuff, it's the mistake that was made and is exposed. And I read a stat the other day that, every organization focuses on on highs and criticals, right? Because that's what compliance says we have to do. But a huge chunk of incidents utilize medium severity, vulnerabilities with exploit kits that are years old and like $4, right? It's end of life systems. It's all of these things that we didn't want to invest in to protect, which seems really easy. It's like an old rotting door that's in the back of the property somewhere that you don't even have to kick down. You can open, blow it open, and walk right in and just sit there. And then, maybe open another door and sell it to somebody else, right? In your work with Ransomware Taskforce, what have you seen in that regard?
Yeah, here we're going to get to something where I'm a little bit soapboxy on. I personally feel like we've over-rotated on the classification of vulnerabilities. So this whole concept of low, medium, high is great as a guideline, but we have to remember that these classifications happen in a sterile environment. That's looking at the bug without any additional context and saying this bug is this kind of risk because it allows these kinds of things to happen to the software it's in, and it allows, it can be accessed with this kind of simplicity. But the fact is, context is king. Anyone who does real research will tell you that it doesn't really matter if a bug is low, medium, or high. It just matters what the bug gets you. If you can get in and get a very simple informational bug that will give you guidance about the infrastructure you're dealing with, that's a win. If you can take that information and use that with a medium bug that grants you access to something else, that's another win. And you chain enough of these small wins together, and they go from being an inch each to being a mile. And I actually have real world experience in doing this. When I did the research against the Tesla Model S back in 2015, we were able to chain 6 different, very simple, small bugs, none of them above a medium, together. And we went from just being able to access some infrastructure in the car to being able to completely control the car to being able to get into Tesla's own factories. And that was just because each step allowed you to go the way. So I think that organizations need to focus on visibility about these bugs and need to understand that no assessment is accurate unless it's done with context. What are the systems touching? What are the system's neighbor? What does that access grant? Maybe the problem could simply be as big a risk as if someone can display something on a screen, that could be really catastrophic. Take an embedded system inside a car. How catastrophic would it be if someone suddenly makes all of the informational displays in your car go blank? That could be really dangerous, yet the bug is likely only to be classified as a low. So we have to consider the context, and we have to consider the importance of having visibility into that context.
I think that is absolutely on point, because as well as I do that those things would never have been fixed unless someone came to them and showed the cumulative effect, right, of all of these little itty bitty slices, seemingly little itty bitty slices, and how they can be leveraged into something big. And even then, sometimes those aren't fixed without even more context. Context is key to making sure that defenders are arming themselves with the right information to make the right decisions. Because we can't fix everything. We're never going to have more resources than the threat actor, and we don't play by the same rules as the threat actor either, right? We're limited in that regard. So if we're blinding ourselves, whether it's because we're not looking or we're using excuses, then are we really defending? And that was an excellent example of how we can get into a false sense of security, thinking that it's not a big deal individually, right? Instead of looking at a real decision model on how to manage risk.
Yeah.
And I really like that. Yeah.
Log4j was another really great example of how vulnerability management really should start looking a lot more like threat intelligence now, because vulnerability development has completely changed. Log4j dropped, and within about 8 hours, there were effective POCs circulating on Twitter. Within 24 hours, there were multiple kill chains, one which gave you an RCE and one which allowed you to steal secrets like AWS keys, etc. All of that happened within the space of 24 hours. An organization that was sitting by and waiting for the vendor to produce a patch would have been completely blindsided, and I think many were. Organizations that behaved more like threat intelligence, that were plugged into their threat intelligence teams, were watching what was going on in the threat landscape, were prepared for it. And we saw this in the responses that came out from companies. Some companies were on the ball, and within 24 hours, they had a good picture of the risk out for their people. And other companies didn't even have a picture months afterwards.
Oh my God. I know. I could tell you. I mean, I've lived through that too. And of course, I was with another company at the time and walked them through that very large company. It surprised me because, Mark, you and I were in some of these same circles, right? It surprised me how much work some of our peers had to do to even convince their teams this was an issue. How long it took to mobilize the troops, because they weren't working as an intelligence organization. They weren't working by making sure they had, enough. And when I say sensors, I don't mean technology sensors. I mean people. I mean bridges into lifelines of other groups where they could band together and start making these decisions fast. And with people that know what the consequences would be, and how many times they'd be faced with people trying to explain it away, right? Not a big deal. We have compensating controls. Not against this, you don't. Not if you don't know where it is, you don't, right?
Yep.
And I still stress eat thinking about it.
One of the things that made me laugh during the whole Log4j thing was because people didn't really understand how logging architectures work. They didn't really understand how the bug was going to be executed in many cases. And so there was this flurry of people testing the bug out and thinking that it didn't do anything and nothing worked. And then at certain defined intervals, like 12 hours later, 24 hours later, a week later, etc., all these shells started popping because that was when the logging processes were running. And so that was when things were getting triggered. And the fact that people sort of just misunderstood that so badly was pretty funny to me.
And even now, almost 18 months later, it's still an incredibly useful vulnerability, that attackers are using to set up shop and maintain persistence. And even in those early days when we were rushing, and thankfully my organization was one that was able to get things locked down fairly early, at least in a meaningful way, and do a lot of good things. There was still resistance. So, well, how come, if it's such a big deal, how come you're not seeing all of these things being popped in the news? Yep. And, the reality is that if you're a victim, you don't need to disclose, nobody's going to say that. And as we mentioned before earlier, sometimes they want to sit and wait and they want to sell. There's definite organizations that are going to sell this for, whatever threat actor wants to use that access at any given time. So I want to switch over to another piece of the puzzle that we had talked about before that I think is important. When I talk to defenders, and I've run security for very large organizations, as you have, we tend to subscribe to this audit method of testing, right? And I used to be an auditor a long time ago, but that was accounting. When you're dealing with systems that have defined rules and have to be built in certain ways. And as an auditor, you're just verifying that it's built that way, right? Because it has to be built that way. There's no rogue infrastructure in your debits and credits. They got to equal out, but yet we've translated this over, this sampling mentality, right, into how we perform security, because we're trying to find a way to maximize resources. What do you see as the strengths and maybe problems with that from, Mark, from what an attacker might view or what they actually do?
So the reality is auditing is fine for getting a sense of something, but it's never going to give you the whole picture. Not only are you dealing with the challenge that not all your systems are created equal, there are always going to be deviations that you're potentially going to miss if you make an assumption and audit on it. But also, is your check even up to date? I've gone through compliance programs, as I'm sure you have, where I've looked at the things that we're supposed to test for and check against a sample and gone like, why are we doing this? I remember actually getting into a fight way back with a PCI auditor because the organization I work for—
Me too.
Right. The organization I work for used SSH and certificates for authentication throughout its network. And so, the PCI requirement that you lock an account after a certain number of attempts didn't really apply because, you can't do that in that way. The control is whether or not you actually have the certificate and the passkey to the certificate, not the number of times that you get in. And they just didn't get it. And they wanted a compensating control that allowed them to put it into their terms. And it's like, why are we wasting time on techniques that aren't even relevant anymore? And why are we making assumptions that it's going to give us a good and accurate sample of what the real picture is, when we know for a fact that things couldn't be more different in some of our organizations?
Well, that's true. I don't think we even give ourselves the chance, to effectively set up sampling. Like, sampling isn't bad because you can't watch everything all the time, right? You have to take some risks, right? And sampling or statistical sampling allows you to manage that risk under certain conditions. The problem is, when was the last time, aside from me, that you met a data scientist or someone with really, really strong statistical backgrounds that's designing these testing cadences? It's not a normal path into security, even though I would say our strongest statisticians are the ones that are trying to find evil in a network, because evil is supposed to be rare, right? And so maybe there's that. But in general, when we're setting up these tests, if we don't have visibility into the network, we're not really understanding the collection to even sample, right? Yep. I go back to this like house or building analogy, and I think that this is kind of what the threat actors rely on, because, like I said, there's a whole bunch of organizations out there on the threat actor side that will just enumerate you all damn day, right? And then sell that work. They'll do it at scale and they'll sell that work so that when someone actually wants to get a pop in, they've done the work and they can just buy it. So when we focus on sampling and we don't have a good handle on third-party builds, on acquisitions, on things that are getting connected to us, and who does, Mark?
Yeah.
What have you seen? I've not seen many organizations that have that luxury, but I feel like if you don't invest in that piece and you're relying on sampling, you're blinding yourself to a very, very small piece that you already know, and it can really turn out poorly if you take that one little test and assume everything looks like that, when we're not even testing to see if we know what the unknowns are.
I think there's
what do you see?
I think there's a very simple question that organizations can ask themselves. And that question is, am I sampling in an intelligent way because it provides me with a resource-efficient way to test something specific? Or am I sampling to check a box? Because if it's sampling to check a box, then I would argue that's not a security control. It's just a box that you're checking. Because you need to guide the way you're doing it to make sure that you're actually looking for the right things. And then you're not being blindsided by other things that are happening that fall outside of your use case because you're not going about this in an intelligent fashion.
Well, what are some of the things that you would advise an organization? What type of capabilities should they have in order to use a technique like sampling? Or, because you're not maybe, I think we're testing too infrequently. As you mentioned, things change so much. Even we're building applications, we're usually not testing them when they change in a material way. Even the big guys don't do that really reliably, let alone what actually happens in production. Don't get me started on stage versus production. I won't get you started either. Look, it's like trauma response for both of us. So, what would you tell organizations? Because of course we can't watch everything. We can't do everything. What type of conditions should they have set up to make something like that successful or at least usable?
So from my perspective, one of the most important things is that whatever you're sampling should be after the implementation of controls that ensure that that thing is going to be right. So you have controls that ensure that things are going to be executed in the way that they should be to be secure. And then you use sampling to gain some assurity that that's happening and it's happening at a decent scale. But you don't rely on sampling to be the control, because by the time you find out something is bad through sampling, you're already way past the curve. That means it's probably been bad for a long time. And if it comes back with a significant number of failures, it means it's been wrong at scale. That's a failure of the information security management program as a whole, and not just a failure of that single thing. The other thing I would say is to be realistic about what you're sampling about. Like, if it's something that is changing continuously, is there really value in doing like a defined set of samples? Unless you can come up with an intelligent way of sampling it that takes into account the fact that things are going to change, or do it at an interval which makes it valid enough, then I would reconsider it and look at maybe another way of testing.
What about, so as we're wrapping up here, the final question that I wanted to ask, of course, we could talk forever, but what are some of the things that you feel attackers rely on us not to do? Or what do you think they hope we don't start doing that we know we should invest in?
I think there's a couple of really obvious ones here. I think, probably number one of the list is that they rely on us not to be consistent about credential management. They rely on us to do things like store credentials in GitHub repositories, or leak them in code, or allow improper handling of them, allow developers to put them on their laptops at home and access the corporate network. All of these kind of inconsistencies, the failure to change passwords after breaches, or to rotate out passwords after employees have left, or all of that, that's probably number one. And that's why passwords are probably the number one way that breaches, ransomware attacks, all of these things happen. The next one I would say is they rely on us not to know what we have out there. They rely on us to fail at asset management, to have exposed systems out there that are outside of controls because we simply don't know that they're there, to have vulnerable, critical systems exposed to public networks because for simplicity, they needed to be accessible. We saw a ton of that happen because of COVID, people just opening things up so that remote workers could gain access.
And they're still open.
And they're still open. And that comes to my third thing, is that they rely on us not to fix our technical debt. And that technical debt includes things like patching. They know that we're underwater and that as security leaders, we have to make decisions about prioritizing resources. And that means stuff gets left behind. And they rely on us not to circle back and to fix that stuff, to put those patches in, to close those COVID provisions that allowed access.
Yeah, I agree. That's 100% right. I remember, when we went through COVID and they would always be like, how is this changing? And I said, listen, I'm telling you what, we're opening up a lot of stuff. I guarantee you in a couple of years, that stuff's still going to be open because people are going to forget the trauma of it, forget the reason why it was locked down, and they're going to forget to close the door.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark. I think this has been a great conversation. I'm looking forward to having you on again and talking about more things. Brian, do you want to wrap us up really quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you, Mark, for this excellent conversation. It gives unique perspective and insight into ways that, you know, the defender typically doesn't get to see. So much appreciated and fun to witness on my end as well. So thank you both for your time, and thank you to everyone in the audience for attending as well. And hope you all have a wonderful.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate having you here.
Cheers. Thank you, guys. Bye.